For the latest in strategic affairs, subscribe to our YouTube channel. Click the bell icon for updates.
Hello and welcome to another edition of Capital Calculus. This is the show that examines policies and developments through the intersection of politics and economics to share a fresh perspective with you every week, especially in seeking to unpack the underlying strategic imperatives. I'm your host, Anil Padmanabhan. Over the last few weeks and months, we have had mixed tidings on the Indian economy. Inflation is defiant, the rupee is depreciating, but consumer sentiment, as we just saw over Diwali, is seeing an uptick. Similarly, the investment cycle is stirring. On the other hand, in the big macroeconomic news, the UNDP reported last week that India lifted 415 million people out of poverty in just 16 years, ending 21. That is more than the population of the United States. What do we make of all these bits of information that are flowing before us? We thought we'd speak to Vivek Debroy. Vivek has so many introductions, I don't even know where to begin. But at the present moment, he is the chairman of the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council, a veteran economist that he is. Both this give him a vantage point to guide us through what is going to play out for the Indian economy. Welcome, Vivek, to the show.
Thank you. It's always a pleasure to talk to you on camera, without the camera. Thank you.
Thank you, Vivek. I'll just dive straight into our questions. The single biggest economic news that happened last week was that India lifted 415 million people out of poverty in the last 16 years, according to the UNDP. I do know that you have also been part of a co-authored study which had similar conclusions in the last decade. So, what are your first thoughts, and how did India pull this off?
Well, there's several ways to respond to that. Firstly, obviously, there's been growth, and there's been growth. Sometimes we don't recognize that for almost 3 decades now, India has had fairly high rates of growth on an average. So, if there's growth, then of course people will be lifted out of poverty. To say that people have not moved above the poverty line is to do violence to common sense, is to also do violence to data. There is also a question of defining the poverty line. What do we mean by the poverty line? And the absence of data, because data traditionally has come through the national sample survey. Those data are old, so therefore one has used various other methods. There was a partly transitory issue of what happened as a result of the COVID pandemic in terms of its cost, in terms of its impact, such as medical costs, the exogenous shock on people who are just above the poverty line or just below the poverty line. But once one moves away from that, it's patently obvious that growth does lead to reductions in poverty. I should also say that since May 2014, this government has done all kinds of different things for the poor, and in my view, they have also helped to reduce poverty.
So, Vivek, one particular strand of the strategy, which has been a central focus since 2014, has been targeting the deprivation deficits, just like the UNDP prescribed, either in pairs or in clusters, whether we look at sanitation, health, etc. So, this presumably complemented the search from growth, right?
Yes, well, there is a double kind of answer to that. The first kind of answer to that is to ask, why are people deprived? Why are people disadvantaged in the first place? Because everyone Unless someone is disabled, unless someone is old, every person in the working age groups wants to improve his or her condition in life. So if they continue to be disadvantaged, that is because they lack much of the physical infrastructure and social infrastructure. And this is what this government has been doing since May 2014, whether it is transport, whether it is water, whether it is electricity, whether it is gas, whether it is toilets, whether it is financial products. So, this is the best possible interpretation that one can give to the word inclusion. Now, all of these essentially are collective private goods. So, provide them to areas, geographical areas that have been historically bypassed and marginalized. And it is not just government dashboards, third party audits also show that these have had benefits. And it is my belief that had it not been for the provision of these basic necessities, India would have fared worse under the pandemic. So, this is one part, the provision of the collective private goods. The second part of the same strategy is to identify beneficiary households who deserve subsidies. And this has been done through a decentralized fashion through what is known as the SECC. And this is linked to providing subsidies directly into bank accounts, DBT, and this has been integrated with the financial, with the bank accounts, integrated with Aadhaar, so on and so forth. So there are two prongs to the strategy. One is the collective private goods, and the second one is the individual subsidy to targeted beneficiaries.
So, Vivek, another way of looking at this phenomenal achievement of lifting 415 million people out of poverty is that they also morph into that many new economic agents. So, going forward, do you believe that this is going to be the the kind of left side, left field boost to growth in the future?
Yes, absolutely. Because you see, since I remember the days when India opened up in 1991 and there was the talk of a consumer market. Initially, that consumer market did not materialize. Now, my response to your question is twofold. Firstly, this upliftment, this rising above the poverty line, this increase in income obviously means a market. It obviously means an increase in consumption expenditure, but also it means that people have now been empowered, people have now become productive and will become even more productive, and therefore it is also greater productivity that boosts growth in the slightly longer run.
So, thank you, Vivek, for explaining it so cogently for us. The Now moving on to the not so good news, which is inflation. It's the seems to be the single biggest macroeconomic challenge, particularly uh, in the backdrop of the triple whammy that is COVID-19, Russia-Ukraine conflict, and now this aggressive tightening by the US Fed and other central banks, which are roiling the markets. How is India coping?
Um, Inflation, there was partly an element of food inflation which was caused by temporary mismatches between supply and demand. That always comes and goes because there's a season food inflation. If you take away the food inflation, it also depends a little bit on what kind of indicator you're using for inflation. Because there's a wholesale price index, there is a consumer price index. I would say that if you take away the food inflation part of it, which, as I said, was transitory, we are on an inflation trajectory right now of something like 6.5%. 6.5% quite clearly is higher than what had been achieved since May 2014. And one of the signal successes of this government was to keep inflation in check. So inflation is higher than that. It's higher than what one might be called a comfort zone. Is 6.5% alarming? I don't think it's alarming. I think the more relevant question is what can you possibly do with this inflation? because this inflation is not something that is very readily amenable to monetary policy instruments like raising interest rates. Although, because of the higher inflation, I think we are also in for a period of slightly higher interest rates. Much of this inflation is actually imported inflation. It's because of increases in prices of commodities, including crude. So I think the simple answer is we just have to learn to live with a slightly higher level of inflation. But as I said, it's not alarming, it's not unmanageable.
That's a big source of comfort. Vivek, you alluded to the monetary policy role being limited in this kind of an inflationary phase. So, is there something the union government can do at this point of time?
I presume you meant on inflation.
Yes.
On inflation, you see, uh, as I said, this inflation is because of a supply shock. It's because of a supply shock, and the best thing, many of the reforms that this union government has done pre-COVID and continued with after the COVID pandemic went out of the way is what can be called supply side reforms. The supply side reforms, in effect, stimulate production. So I think the best thing that the union government can do, two things actually. A, to continue with the supply side reforms, to ensure the implementation of the supply side reforms so that there is greater production. And B, to ensure that there is no deviation from the fiscal consolidation targets. One of the remarkable successes of this government since May 2014 was adherence to fiscal consolidation and not deviating from the targets, because that has costs, including in the form of inflation. There was a temporary deviation because of the consequences of COVID. So I think that's the second most important thing that the union government can do, is to return to that path of fiscal consolidation.
So, Vivek, you mentioned the government should continue with also supply side reforms. What is the kind of reforms agenda supply side that you envisage at this point of time?
Um, you see, if one there's a long list of reforms that the union government has done. Uh, to state the obvious, this is a federal kind of country, so many reforms are state government subjects. Most of the reforms that the union government has done is are in the nature of liberalization, simplifying, self-certification, removing equity caps, throwing open a sector, whether it is for domestic investments or foreign investments. The long pending reforms pertain to land markets and labor markets. Land is completely in the state list, labor is in the concurrent list. On the union government side, as the viewer is aware, and as you are aware, there's been an attempt to consolidate several more than 50 labor laws under four heads. But this is the beginning of a process. Exactly similarly, on the land side, there is a lot that needs to be done, and and land reforms are contingent, are depend are land reforms determine the nature and shape of agricultural reforms also. So there is an issue that you have not mentioned so far, but I'm mentioning it now. You mentioned poverty, but there's also the question of employment generation. That employment generation cannot happen until the land markets are reformed, unless the labor markets are reformed.
That's a great point, Vivek. But that means if the states have to be equal players in going forward, especially with India's target of becoming a developed country by 2047, how does that consensus get manufactured? We did see in GST this consensus happened, but subsequently it's dipped. So, can we be hopeful that there can be some means where a GST kind of model can be generated to, uh,
Um,
draw a path forward, particularly say on land and labor reforms?
um, you use the expression developed. In 2047, If I use classic definitions of developed, classic definitions, we won't exactly be a developed country. We will be an upper middle income country, which is the classification the World Bank now uses of 10,000 US dollars. But leave that aside. The GST Council, people may have complaints about the GST, about the rates, about the multiplicity, about the non inclusion of items into the GST, but all said and done, it's been a phenomenal success in terms of decision making, in terms of decision making between the union government and the states. You're absolutely right that we need a similar kind of exercise in a limited sense on expenditure, because part of the debate is about what the government should be spending on and at what level, and where the resources come from that. And this is not just about union state, it is also about devolution within states, and part of it is about broader reform issues. So I think we do need a forum to discuss these issues between union government and state governments. In that sense, we do need a consensus. Do we want a fresh forum, or do we need to relook at the way Niti Aayog works, or the NDC works, or the Interstate Council works? I'm not very sure. But you're absolutely right that the GST Council has shown us there are means of ensuring consensus, if not unanimity, between the union government and the states. And the same kind of thing should now be done on the expenditure side and more broadly on the reform side.
Great. That note of optimism, I'll move on to another macroeconomic signal, which is actually very positive consumer sentiment, especially if you look at what just happened during the Diwali festival season. There seems to be a massive uptick, but this flies in the face of rising inflation. So, what does this consumer sentiment tell us? Because they are normally very astute observers of the economy, even though they may not be qualified economists. So, what is your reading as to why is it that consumer sentiment is not getting dented at this point, relatively?
Well, you asked about consumer sentiments, but some of those points also exist for investments, private investments. Uh, the background is the following, that given what is going on in the world, the main sources of growth have to be consumption, investments, and government expenditure, because exports are going to be constrained by whatever is happening globally. Government expenditure is constrained by requirements of fiscal consolidation. So we come to consumption and investment. On consumption, whenever there is uncertainty, whenever there is uncertainty, the discretionary part of consumption expenditure tends to be postponed. Exactly similarly, investments also, if they can be postponed, depends on the capacity utilization. They also tend to be postponed whenever there is uncertainty. It is my belief that there was uncertainty after COVID and the lockdown, but post COVID and the lockdown, that uncertainty is gradually going away. It's going away because people are certain about the continuity of government policies. People are certain that India's macro fundamentals remain sound, and therefore, now that that uncertainty is over, part of it is, of course, pent up demand, which could not happen during COVID. I think we will see a recovery both in consumption and in investment. You are absolutely right that high inflation tends to deter consumption, which is, but that tends to be countered by the removal of uncertainty. I said earlier that interest rates are not very effective to control the present round of inflation, but interest rates are important to control speculative assumptions about future inflation. So I think a combination of both of these, A, end of uncertainty, continuity of government policies, and macro fundamentals being sound, has ensured that consumer sentiments are still high.
Okay. So, Vivek, you're saying that policy has been calibrated to a large extent to fight this, or rather, dent this uncertainty. But there is one big challenge, again, which is an imported factor, like you pointed out very early in our conversation, is the rupee. Now, the depreciating rupee, is it about the rupee depreciation or is it about the dollar strengthening? Because globally, every currency seems to be losing ground to the dollar.
Um, the dollar has been appreciating vis-a-vis all currencies in the world, or all major currencies in the world, and there are reasons for that. So far as the rupee is concerned, normatively, from the point of view of keeping exports competitive, from the point of view of ensuring that we continue to compete with our trading partners in export markets, to ensure that differences in rates of inflation do not erode that competitiveness, the rupee needs to depreciate. There are two flip sides to this argument. The first flip side is whenever the rupee depreciates, that tends to reinforce inflation to the extent that that inflation is based on important imported products. Secondly, there is a difference between a secular trend of depreciation or appreciation, as the case may be, and reducing the volatility. So it's my view that what the central bank should be doing is to intervene to reduce the volatility, but not counter the secular trend of depreciation or appreciation. In this particular case, of course, we are talking about the depreciation of the vis-a-vis the of the rupee vis-a-vis the dollar. And I think this is essentially what the central bank has doing, because remember, intervention, whether it's in the form of buying dollars or selling dollars, it is not costless, it has costs. So normatively, I think we should accept that the fact that the rupee needs to depreciate vis-a-vis the US dollar as it has been doing.
So interesting. A subtext of what you have been just said and what you've been saying earlier is that a lot of these shocks are now getting normalized in by the Indian economy. In the sense, you are learning to deal with this rather than having an emergency response to every shock. Right? I mean, is that a right interpretation?
Yes, because the nature of the economy today is such that it is less vulnerable to sudden exogenous shocks. You and I don't know about younger viewers, will remember the oil price shocks that happened several decades ago. So the Indian economy is less vulnerable, and it's less vulnerable also because there are multiple sources of growth. The Indian economy is not one which is excessively dependent on exports. As I said earlier, there are other sources of growth. There is plenty of slack within the system to ensure growth from those. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that the Indian economy is insulated. No economy can be. Had all of these global factors not happened, we would probably have aspired to an 8.5% rate of growth. Given what is happening externally, we cannot have an 8.5%, but we can certainly aspire towards a 7% rate of growth. It may fall short of what we actually wanted, but 7% is pretty decent, which again substantiates the point about the Indian economy being less vulnerable to external shocks.
Okay. Vivek, it's interesting. Your thoughts were echoed by uh, Ananta Nageshwaran, our chief economic advisor, in an op-ed he wrote. And you also alluded to it earlier that how the reforms carried out in the last few years have improved the plumbing in the economy. So, which means the crisis, when it ebbs, this presumably is transitory, the three shocks we mentioned, the economy will get a fresh boost from the efficiencies that these reforms have built in. Ananta actually alluded to the phase of 1998 to 2002 when the world economy posed similar shocks. That time it was thanks to terrorism, etc. But the geopolitical impact was identical. So, your thoughts?
No, I broadly agree with it. You see, the only difference I may have is on what is the rate of growth likely to be. I'm likely to be perhaps half a percentage point um, less optimistic compared to Anand. But broadly, you see, everyone would agree with that diagnosis that the reforms have unleashed an increase in entrepreneurship, an increase in productivity, which was temporarily shackled because of the pandemic and the effects of the pandemic. Now that the pandemic is out of the way, then we are going to then we are going to gain from the benefits of those reforms. Now there is no particular reason to change the trajectory of reforms, because any thoughts on changing the trajectory of reforms is tantamount to saying that we did something wrong since May 2014. There is no evidence whatsoever that the strategy since May 2014 was wrong in any sense. And therefore, the answer is to, apart from tweaking here and tweaking there, the answer is to continue with what has been done since May 2014, now that the 2 years of dislocation caused by the pandemic are over.
So, Vivek, just staying on that thought, that means the focus, say the next 6 months or 8 months, given this uncertainty and the volatility, macroeconomic volatility that we have seen, uh, should be on stabilizing the economy to these shocks rather than going for growth. Is it?
Um,
Make sense?
I wouldn't put it in those stark terms. I would say that the economy has weathered the shocks, the, the pandemic shocks and the post pandemic shocks reasonably well. It is important to ensure that one continues to do what one has been doing and do nothing particularly spectacular right now, because that stability alone will ensure that we will resume that growth path. If one says, what can I do to stimulate growth? Well, what can you possibly do other than what you have been doing? So therefore, continue to do that.
So, Vivek, in a few weeks, actually, the work has already begun, the preparation for next year's union budget. In the last few years, particularly after COVID, the budget is back as a central, important economic document, economic activity in this country. So, what do you think, given this tumultuous periods that we have seen? Actually, it's a huge challenge to be an FM at this point. Every quarter, there's a new macroeconomic picture that comes up before you. So, going forward to the next budget, what do you think should be the, say, the top 2 or 3 priorities that it should focus on?
Um, well, the budget technically, and you and I have written on budgets for donkey's years, a budget technically is nothing but the union government's annual statement of receipts and expenditure. But a budget, rightly, particularly the budget speech, is perceived to be much more than that. It is a statement of intent. It is a statement indicating what is it that the government is trying to do, what is it that the government is trying to do this particular year, what is it that the government is planning to do in the medium term. And remember, the next budget will be the budget that will feed into the electoral cycle. There is a pending agenda of tax reforms. By pending agenda of tax reforms, I mean direct taxes. I'm not very sure, which would primarily mean the elimination of exemptions. I'm not very sure that we have had enough of a debate on that, on the direct tax code, so to speak. So, my main expectation from the budget would be one, to state that message very clearly about continuity, about the medium term trajectory, about the fiscal consolidation. So, that would be my main expectation from the budget, to state very clearly that this is what the government is trying to do, this is the focus, these are the priorities, this is the medium term trajectory, and this is the fiscal consolidation strategy.
So, Vivek, you actually made a very important point about the fact that this is the last budget before the next general election. So, in last year, I remember when we discussed the budget, everyone was talking about how this is just a prelude to another big takeout next year, but no one anticipated the Ukraine conflict and subsequent macro shocks. So, do you think there's an opportunity lost because after this, there is no window? Uh,
No, but opportunity lost means the expression suggests that you had the option to do something else. I don't think there was much of an option. Had this not happened, what is the most important big ticket item? The most important big ticket item would have been reforms on direct taxes. Yes, there is the national monetization pipeline, there is the privatization, but that apart, I think the most important item would have been the direct tax code. That I think, because of this uncertainty, has unfortunately got postponed a bit.
so, Vivek, final question. As the chairman of the Economic Advisory Council, how do you see the short term, which you've alluded to, but how would you sum up the short term outlook on the Indian economy and the medium term outlook? I dare not ask about the long term.
Short term, by short term, usually people mean this particular financial year. This particular financial year, I think we'll do about 7%, maybe a decimal point or a couple of decimal points short, about 7-ish. The next 3 years or so, I would expect 6.5%. I mentioned earlier a slight difference in opinion, perhaps between me and some others. I would say 6.5, some others would say 7. So I think in the next few years, 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, we are talking about 6.5 to 7%. Remember, however, that all India growth rates are an aggregate fundamentally. If you leave out defense and railways and national highways and telecom, they are fundamentally an aggregation of what happens at the level of the states. So if the states begin to grow faster, then we might do better. But otherwise, 6.5 to 7%.
Okay. Thank you, Divik. I think you have really clarified a lot of issues here. I'm grateful for that. And thank you very much once again for doing this with us. Thank you for watching. Do subscribe to Strat News Global on YouTube and remember to hit the bell icon so that you don't miss any updates. And please do share your comments and insights with us. I am available on Twitter at Capital Calculus. I'll be back next week with another episode. Till then, stay safe.